In my years of family practice, and then for 7 years, I was medical coordinator of the palliative care unit at Vancouver Hospital, which is to say, we looked after terminally ill people. I found that who got sick and who didn't was not at all accidental. That there were certain patterns that I inevitably had to be aware of. And all the people that got sick with chronic illness, whether that be, again, cancer, autoimmune disease, neurological disorders like ALS, MS, Parkinson's, and so on. What these patterns were, and I'm telling you, which may sound dogmatic, but I've been at the game long enough to be convinced of this, that there are no exceptions. I'm going to read you some newspaper clippings that illustrate who is illness prone, and then I'll tell you why. The first is an article. These are all articles from the Globe and Mail newspaper, which is Canada's national paper, and I wrote a medical column for them for a couple of years. It's by a woman. The first article is by a woman who was diagnosed with breast cancer. Her name is Donna, her doctor's name is Harold, and her husband is called Hai. And Hai, his first wife, died of breast cancer, and now Donna, the second wife, is diagnosed with the same condition. And Donna writes in his first-person account of her visit to the doctor's office, "Harold tells me that the lump is small, and most assuredly not in my lymph nodes, unlike that of Hai's first wife, whose cancer had spread everywhere by the time they found it. You're not going to die," he reassures me. "But I'm worried about Hai," I say. "I won't have the strength to support him." Now what do you notice? She's the one diagnosed with a potentially fatal illness, will have to go through chemo, radiation, possibly surgery, and her first thought is, how will I support my husband emotionally? So this automatic and compulsive regard for the emotional needs of others while ignoring your own is a major risk factor for disease. Major risk factor. The others that I will read you are actually obituaries from the same newspaper, and obituaries are fascinating because they tell us not just about the person who died, but also about what we value in one another unwittingly. And what we value in one another is exactly what kills us. You've heard the expression, the good die young. Half of you are breathing easily right now and you're not worried. So this obituary is about a physician died age 55 of cancer. Never for a day did he contemplate giving up the work he so loved at Toronto's Sick Children's Hospital. He carried on with his duties throughout his year-long battle with cancer, stopping only a few days before he died. So what would you say to a friend of yours diagnosed with cancer? Go back to work tomorrow, and all the while that you're getting treatment, ignore that, ignore your needs, don't think at all about your life, and just keep working until you drop. So this automatic and rigid identification with duty, role, and responsibility, rather than the needs of the self, is the second major risk factor for chronic illness. The next one is written by a husband who is writing this with gratitude about his wife who died age 55 of breast cancer. In her entire life, she never got into a fight with anyone. The worst you could say was phooey or something else along those lines. She had no ego. She just blended in with the environment in an unassuming manner. And I'm sure that, like me, many of you have partners, spouses, sometimes you wish that they would blend in with the environment. In an unassuming manner. But they won't do that if they want to stay healthy. Because the suppression of the so-called negative emotions, particularly anger, actually suppresses the immune system. And finally, this obituary, which is almost beyond belief, but it's real. This is a physician who died at age 72 of cancer. Sidney and his mother had an incredibly special relationship, a bond that was apparent in all aspects of their lives until her death. As a married man with young children, Sidney made a point to have dinner with his parents every day as his wife Rosalind and their 4 young kids waited for him at home. Never wanting to disappoint either woman in his life, Sidney would walk in, greeted by yet another dinner to eat and to enjoy, until gradual weight gain began to raise suspicions. This man suffered from two fatal beliefs. One is that he's responsible for how other people feel, and secondly, that he must never disappoint anybody. So these four factors, this automatic concern for the emotional needs of others, ignoring your own, compulsory and rigid identification with duty, role, and responsibility rather than the authentic self, suppression of so-called negative emotions, repression of them, and finally the belief that you're responsible for how other people feel and that you must never disappoint anybody, so you never say no. These are the significant risk factors that are present in cases of chronic illness, and they're quite capable of killing you for reasons I'll explain shortly. But before I do, let's explain why people behave in these ways. Are we blaming the patient for the disease? We're not blaming the patient for the disease because these are not deliberate, consciously chosen patterns. Remember that Harvard article I quoted to you? Adaptations that help you survive the immediate stress in childhood become source of pathology later on. These are all adaptations. Nobody chooses to behave in these ways. And I can give you a personal example. So when I was 54 or so, I had arthroscopic surgery on one of my knees. I had a bit of a tear in a cartilage. So that afternoon I had a bit of a limp. And I'm visiting my mother, who, there's a genetic disease in our family called muscular dystrophy, which means that if you have the gene, you'll have the disease. But by the way, most diseases are not like that, and there are very few diseases genetically determined. Even in the case of breast cancer, there is a breast cancer gene, or several breast cancer genes, but out of 100 women with breast cancer, only 7 will have the gene. The gene is not the major cause of breast cancer. Muscular dystrophy, yes, if you have the gene, rare, but you're likely to have the disease. So my mother had it, so at age 78, she could no longer get out of bed, she could barely feed herself. Mentally, she was very strong. So I'm visiting her, and as I'm walking down the hall of the nursing home, I have a bit of a limp because of my surgery that morning. When I walk into my mother's room, my limp disappears. I greet her with a perfectly normal gait, and I walk out the same way until I shut the door behind me, and again I start limping. Now what am I doing? I'm protecting her from knowledge of my pain, but here's the deal. My mother, being 78, had survived the Nazi genocide in Hungary, the communist dictatorship, the Hungarian Revolution in '56, emigration to Canada at the age of 39 with a husband nearly 10 years older, and 2 adolescent boys, life in a new culture and a new language. She was a very strong person. Did she need to be protected from the fact that her middle-aged son had a bit of a limp? The afternoon of surgery. However, remember that quote from Amos, that the child feels the suffering of and pain of the mother. So I was born in January 44 in Budapest to Jewish parents. When I was two months old, the Germans occupied Hungary. And you can imagine what the rest of our year was like. And I learned very early that my mother was so stressed that if I wanted to maintain the attachment relationship with her, I better suppress my own pain because she was already overburdened. So that was an adaptation. And that adaptation still shows up in my automatic suppression of my limp 53 years later. This is what Robin Williams, who died at his own hands after a life of addiction, mental illness, and workaholism, called the please love me syndrome. Anything, I'll do anything but love me. See, the child has no choice. The child is in a situation where attachment, and attachment in this case is not in a Buddhist sense, but this is the modern psychological sense. Attachment is the drive for closeness and proximity with another human being for the purpose of being taken care of, or of taking care of someone else. So there's this powerful attachment drive between all mammals and their children, and their offspring, even birds and their offspring. That attachment drive keeps the infant close to the parent close to the infant, so the infant can be taken care of. And that attachment drive is important to us all our lives, as that example of those elderly couples indicates. In other words, that's the most important dynamic in human life, and our brains are largely wired for attachment, without which we don't survive, because the human infant is the least mature, most dependent, and most helpless of any creature in the universe, and stays that way for the longest period of time. So without attachment, there's no life. This attachment drive, as I'll be telling you later in my talk on addiction this afternoon, is the source of, when the attachment needs are not met, this is the source of all pathology, whether physical or mental. And How does it become a source of physical pathology? Well, because we have another need. We have the need for attachment, that's clear. But we have another need, and that is need for authenticity. Authenticity is the sense of being ourselves, and knowing who we are and what we feel. Now, that's not a new age, abstract, psychological, spiritual, woohoo need. It's actually a survival need. Because to be authentic is to be in touch with your body and your gut feelings. And in the long period of evolutionary development, living in a state of nature amidst all kinds of dangers, how long exactly would a human being survive if they were not in touch with their gut feelings? They wouldn't. So that the authenticity is as powerful as the attachment need in the long term. But what happens to a child where the authenticity threatens attachment? And what do I mean by that? Let's say that as a 1.5-year-old, 2-year-old, your child is angry at you. And by the way, if you have a 1.5 and 2-year-old and they're never angry with you, you're not doing your job. Because they can't have 5 cookies before dinner. And they can't climb on the table to play with a shiny knife. So they're going to get frustrated. So they're going to throw a tantrum, which is what they do. But what about if you grow up in a home where there was a rageaholic father, and the very hint of anger threatens you unconsciously? So you give the message to the child that good little kids don't get angry. In other words, good little kids who get angry are not good, they're not acceptable to the parent. Well, guess what? If that message is driven home powerfully enough, the child would repress the anger in order to maintain the attachment relationship. Pure adaptation. But in the long term, that repression of the authentic self, as in the cases I mentioned, is what leads to disease. So this is the please love me syndrome. Love me at any cost. The child, when it comes to attachment versus authenticity, has absolutely no choice in the matter. Because without attachment, they can't survive. Treat me like a fool, treat me mean and cool, but love me. That's not love. Just let me stay attached to you at any cost. Now the problem is that once you make the choice, although it's no choice at all, to go for attachment, then we spend the rest of our lives living that out. And we spend the rest of our lives suppressing our authenticity. Now how does that lead to illness? Well, it leads to illness for the very simple reason as you can't separate the mind from the body. And we now know scientifically that there's no basis for those separations. So it's not that there's a nervous system and an immune system and a hormonal apparatus and a cardiovascular system and an emotional system. It's all part and parcel of the same system. There's a science that's, I would say, is new, but it's only relatively new. It's been around for a few decades now. It's called psychoneuroimmunology, that studies the connections and the unity of the emotional system, the immune system, the hormonal apparatus, and the nervous system. It turns out there aren't separate systems, it's just one. To say that they're even connected is kind of false, because you connect two things that are discrete, but these are not discrete systems. They're just the differentiated functioning of the same super system. So it turns out that the nervous system wires them all together like a giant electrical grid. It connects the bone marrow to the brain. It sends messages from the bone marrow to the brain, from the brain to the bone marrow, where our immune and red cells are manufactured, from the thymus gland in the neck, where the white cells are stored, to the brain and vice versa, the gut to the brain, the heart to the brain, brain to the heart. The heart itself is a nervous system. It's like a second brain in a sense. It has certain predictive capacities, especially for negative things. When we say, I knew in my heart, you did. And that's connected to the brain up here. Then they all secrete messenger substances into the circulation, and they talk to one another biochemically, so that the immune cells, the white cells in your circulation, have the capacity to manufacture every hormone that the brain manufactures. And so the immune system is talking to the brain, and the brain is talking to the immune system. The immune system has been called a floating brain. It's got learning capacity, reactive capacity, and memory, just like the brain does. Then there's the gut-brain connection. I'm going to ask you this question and ask for a show of hands, please. If you've had the following experience, please put your hand up, that you've had a powerful gut feeling about something, you ignored it, and you were sorry afterwards. Okay. Now, let me ask for the obverse. Those of you that have a powerful gut feeling, you ignored it, and you're grateful afterwards, put your hand up. Now you see how much more the majority has is with the gut. Now I would even argue, had I had time, with those of you that just put your hand up, that what you had was not a gut feeling at all, it was just a strong emotion. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. But there's a difference. In that a gut feeling, there's something calm and knowing about it. There's no agitation about it. But nevertheless, even if I take your word for it, it's still like, 30 to 1. So why is the gut so much more intelligent than your thoughts? In other words, when you went with your thoughts, you were wrong. If you paid attention to your gut feelings, you were right. Well, the gut sends many more messages to the brain than come the other way. If you've ever been treated for depression, like I have with, say, Prozac, which elevates serotonin levels, the gut has more serotonin than the brain does, the mood chemical. The gut receives messages from the whole brain, and it magnifies them and sends them back up, so that when you are listening to gut feelings, you're getting the whole picture. Your intellect, your thoughts, are only a very small part of your evaluative apparatus. And emotions came much before we had thoughts, necessarily, because without strong gut feelings, again, we just didn't survive. Now, there's a group of people called aphasiacs who can't process words because they had a stroke in that part of the brain. Aphasiacs have been shown in a number of studies to be much more astute at knowing when somebody's a liar than people who understand language. Why do you suppose that is? Because they take in the whole picture, the body language, the tone of voice, the facial expression, the congruence of body language, tone, and facial expression. And that's a much more significant markers of truth than the words are. If aphasiacs voted, no politician would ever get elected. But there's another large group of people. Who, I mean, if you look, and that may seem like sort of a knock on politicians, but let me tell you, there was a very interesting phenomenon with President George Bush Jr. If you ever, I don't know if you ever had this experience, but if you ever turned off the sound on the television and he was speaking, what would you observe? A very nervous and scared little kid. And this guy was the most powerful man in the world, so they say. Scared little kid. Now, there's another large group of human beings who are perfectly capable of unerringly reading and reacting to their gut feelings. And what do we call those people? What do we call them? Children. We call them babies. Okay, no one-day-old baby is disconnected from the gut feelings. When you put your hand up and I asked you, how many of you had the experience of ignoring and then regretting not having paid attention to gut feelings, you were telling me the story of your childhood. The story of your childhood was that when you were born pristine and authentic, completely in touch with yourself, and then you learned that in order to stay attached to your environment, you had to suppress that part of yourself. So the suppression itself became associated with survival. No wonder you're afraid to be authentic. Because there's something in you that says, if I'm authentic, I won't be loved anymore, and if I'm not loved, I won't survive. Then we keep choosing attachment over authenticity, and then we get sick. Let me give you an example. I just need a volunteer, okay? So I mentioned that the suppression of anger suppresses the immune system, so you're going to volunteer. Thanks. No, you need to stay where you are. What's your name? Judith, okay. So there's one rule here, only Judith, okay? Which is that the chair that you're sitting in is your life, so you can't leave it, okay? For this experiment. After the talk you can leave, or even before the talk, but not for this experiment, okay? So the question I'm going to ask you is, are you okay with the distance between you and I right now? If I spoke from here for the rest of the morning, is that okay with you?
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm going to stand here and ask you the same question. Is it still okay with you? If I lecture from here, how about right now?
Yeah.
Is still okay with you? Okay, what about right now?
It's getting a little tight.
It's getting a little tight?
Yeah, it's okay. It's still okay.
It's still okay. All right, I'm going to put a knee on your knee. You know? How's that now?
It feels good.
It feels good. I'm going to stand on your knee in a minute.
No, you're not.
Okay. How would that feel to you?
I wouldn't like it.
You wouldn't like it. What would you do about it?
I'd have to push you out.
Okay, right. And as you're pushing, what emotion do you think you'd be generating?
Fear and anger.
Anger. The fear would come first.
Yeah.
And then the anger.
Yeah.
So in other words, the anger is not a negative emotion. It's a healthy boundary defense. Healthy anger simply says, you're in my space, get out. That's healthy anger. There's unhealthy anger, but that's different. Healthy anger says, you're in my space. Healthy anger is in the present. It's not about the past and the future. It's a boundary defense, you're in my space, get out. That's it. Now, if you look at the role of emotions in general, what is their job? Now, in another situation with another person, you actually might invite them closer.
Perhaps.
You know, some people in your life, in some situations, you would invite closer. So the role of emotions is to tell you what you want more of and being closer to you, allow in to your space, and to keep out the unwelcome and the potentially dangerous. That's all the emotion. Invite in the nourishing, the healthy, the welcome, keep out the dangerous, threatening, unwelcome. What is the role of the immune system? It's exactly the same thing. The immune system and the emotional system do exactly the same thing. Because of the unity that I mentioned to you, when you suppress the one, you're suppressing the other. And that's why the repression of healthy anger is a significant risk factor for cancer, because the immune system is suppressed. Now, on the other hand, what else can happen? Let's say you repress anger. You're one of these really nice people and you're always helping people. You never say no. And the book of mine that this talk is based on is entitled When the Body Says No. My contention being is if you don't, the body will say it for you. I may have said that before. So, what happens to anger that you don't express? Does it evaporate, go away, fly to the moon? Where does it turn? It turns against you in a form of depression. What does the word depression mean? It means to push something down. It's that simple. It was an adaptation. Depression begins as an adaptation. You have to push down your feelings to stay attached. 30 years later, you're taking Prozac. And they tell you, you got this genetic disease. Nonsense. In the same way that the anger can turn against you in the form of depression or self-loathing, self-blame, in the same way, the immune system can turn against you, so that the immune cells and immune organs that are meant to defend you will not attack you. And that's autoimmune disease, rheumatoid arthritis, scleroderma, Crohn's, colitis, fibromyalgia, and multiple sclerosis. So, I'm going to bring this to a close, and sorry I will not have time for questions, but I'm happy to hang on afterwards and talk to people. I'm going to close with a quote from my honored teacher, Almas, or Hamid Ali, who says, "The fundamental thing that happened, and the greatest calamity, is not that there was no love or support." He's talking about childhood. "The greater calamity, which was caused by that first calamity, is that you lost the connection to your essence. That is much more important than whether your mother or father loved you or not." Well, that's the good news. Because if the problem was that you were not loved, supported, recognized, honored, or if you were abused 15, 30, 50 years ago, if that was the problem, we're stuck because we can't undo the past. But if the problem was that as a result of those events, we disconnected from ourselves in order to maintain, stay attached, ourselves, our essence is still here and we can reconnect. We can reconnect, so that's the good news. And in that sense, although we tend to look upon symptoms and illness as enemies to get rid of, we talk about the war on cancer, the battle against cancer, we can look up at it totally differently. Yeah, receive what medical treatment makes sense to you. I'm a physician, I'm not against medical treatment or medical advancement, but also ask the question, what is my body saying no to that I didn't say no to? What is the meaning of this relapse of my rheumatoid arthritis? What stresses did I impose on myself? Where didn't I say no? And then the illness can actually become your teacher. Your teacher towards what? Towards authenticity. And let me ask you this final question. How many of you know people who have recovered from addiction or some serious illness, and some people even who don't recover from a serious illness, but will still say, and I've heard this many times, I'll still say, that addiction, that illness was the best thing that ever happened to me. How many of you heard such statements? Many of you have. I certainly have in my career as a physician. What are people talking about? They're talking about that the illness forced me to become authentic. It gave me back myself, which is what Almas calls the precious pearl. Thanks very much.